Good evening, everyone. I, Saquib Rahman, Senior Lecturer at the Department of Law, North South University, would like to welcome you all to our webinar today. It would be a pleasure on our part to be able to listen to Professor David Fidler, who has very kindly made the time to talk on a very contemporary issue, the COVID-19 pandemic and the future of international law and global health. Before we request Professor Fidler to start, I would like to bring to the notice of the listeners that the chat box is open and that they may address any questions there in the box. The audience is requested to please keep their microphones off at all times. And lastly, I would extend my thanks on behalf of the Department of Law to all of you present here today. Now, regarding Professor Fidler, he is a James Lewis Calamarese Emeritus Professor of Law at the Maurer School of Law of Indiana University. Professor Fidler specializes in international law, national security, and emerging technologies. He is one of the world's leading experts on cybersecurity law and policy, and cyberspace and international law. Professor Fidler is an adjunct senior fellow for cybersecurity with the Council on Foreign Relations, served as the chair of the International Law Association Study Group on Terrorism, Cybersecurity, and International Law, and is the editor and also contributor to the award-winning The Snowden Reader, which comes from the Indiana University Press. Professor Fidler is also an internationally recognized expert in global health and biosecurity threats. He is an associate fellow with the Center on Global Health Security at the Royal Institute of International Affairs and has been an international legal consultant for the US Centers for Disease Control and Prevention and the World Health Organization, and is on the roster of experts that advises the Director General of the World Health Organization under the international health regulations. Before we listen to Professor Fidler, I would request Professor Dr. Rizwanul Islam, Chair of the Department of Law at North South University, for his introductory remarks.
Thank you, Saquib. Good morning, Professor Fidler. Good morning, or good afternoon, or good evening to our audience, depending on wherever in the world you may be. One would expect that in an issue like global health, we would have some commonalities. After all, pathogenic microbes do not respect boundaries. They do not need passports. Any threat to global health, particularly with regard to infectious diseases, is a collective threat, is a threat to the whole world, as the ongoing COVID pandemic has very badly shown us in recent times. So that commonality of threat would perhaps, one would think that it would make us feel that this is not about nation states, this is not about sovereignty, this is not about borders, this is about global cooperation. As I have tried to argue in one of my forthcoming papers to be published very soon in Texas International Law Journal. But today's talk is not about my paper, it is about Professor Fidler's excellent recent works and forthcoming works. You see, even during the first sanitary conferences during the 19th century, some scholars believe that it was not just about global health, it was more about dealing with trade, or the relation between quarantine and trade. That was the real spar, or as some would cynically say, some scholars have written on it, that it was more about protecting Europe and perhaps America from diseases like cholera, although actually cholera was taking many more lives in Asia than perhaps in Europe or in America. So even from the 19th century, global health has not always been a matter where interests have converged or states have cooperated with each other. During the current pandemic, we can see tensions on many fronts. On one side, we can see some authoritarian regimes are using this COVID pandemic as a means or justification or a sort of ploy to wield more power. On the other hand, some nationalistic forces, some leaders, they are trying to use it to settle geopolitical scores. The global body, World Health Organization, is suffering from some sort of chronic shortage of funding. The funding that WHO has is perhaps less than many national bodies like CDC in the US. So that chronic lack of funding, the geopolitical tensions, using disease, using public health as a ploy for settling scores, and also about tension regarding vaccines, vaccine production, vaccines sharing. All these things are creating new questions for international lawyers, for global public health practitioners, observers. So I look forward to Professor Fidler's talk at how he envisions the future for international legal scholars, for global public health practitioners, for observers, and for the humanity. Thank you, Professor Fidler, once again for making time for our students, my esteemed colleagues. And I also look forward to the question from the audience. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Sorry. Professor Fidler, whenever you're comfortable, please.
Okay. Sorry about that. I'm just going to share my screen for everybody because I've got a few slides. Let me just begin by thanking Professor Islam and his colleagues at the Department of Law. Let me thank Saquib, Zidane, Nayem for making this possible and bringing us all together on Zoom to talk about, I think, one of the most pressing issues that we face as international community, but also, I think, for those interested in the role of international law over the course of the next decade. I think the global health issue is going to be one of those that keeps us occupied. And so I want to cover a few things in the 30 minutes that I have to make some remarks. And I want to organize my talk according to three categories. The first, I want to talk about the COVID-19 pandemic as being the big one. In my years of working on global health, there was sort of this anticipation, this fear that the next disease outbreak would be the big one, would be the one that really challenges and stresses not only public health systems, but also the governance and political systems that we put in place to deal with these issues. At least in terms of the 21st century, so far, COVID-19 has been the big one. So I want to talk about that just briefly from a global health perspective, but also to look at this, the big one, from an international lawyer's point of view. The second set of comments that I want to make is about the big one becoming the bad one. As Professor Islam indicated, the nature of the responses to the COVID-19 pandemic, particularly at the international level, have been very bad. I mean, if we just be honest with what we've seen happen here. And I want to talk about that in terms of international law, but I also want to focus on global health governance, which doesn't always involve international laws, but often supported by international legal instruments. But I want to focus most of my remarks on how bad it has been with regards to the COVID pandemic by looking at some political transformations, which I think help explain why things have been so awful. And those transformations are both at the global level as well as the domestic level. Finally, I want to address, what are we doing about the next pandemic, the next one? How are we going to put in place legal instruments, global governance mechanisms, systems, in order that the response to the next pandemic, which is foreseeable It's going to happen. What are we doing in that context, and what are the prospects for that? So I'll talk about some of the proposals that have been made, both with regards to international and global health governance, and then I want to talk a little bit about the prospects for are we going to see any of these transformative legal and global governance changes in connection with global health? Sorry. I don't think this audience needs much education about the global health catastrophe that COVID-19 has been. I just captured a screenshot from the World Health Organization yesterday, sort of giving an indication of those total numbers in terms of cases, confirmed cases, deaths, vaccination doses that have been given. From a global health perspective, this really has been, one of the worst pandemics of the last century. So it's quite easy to see from a global health point of view why the COVID-19 pandemic has been such a global health crisis. It's also the case that this has been a crisis at national levels everywhere around the world. So it's very difficult to find any bright spots at the national level with regards to either how countries responded or the exposure of the lack of capabilities to deal with a pathogen that has been this dangerous, this transmissible, and this lethal. And again, this audience doesn't need information necessarily about what's going on in Bangladesh, but again, a screenshot from WHO indicating the numbers for Bangladesh. This story at the national health level is one that has been apparent whether the countries we're looking at with regards to these kinds of details are high income, middle income, or low income countries. It's been bad across the board from a health perspective. And I want to move beyond the health perspective because this pandemic has been the big one in connection with the adverse consequences that it's had across just about every aspect of political, economic, and individual life. This slide just captures a conclusion from a US National Intelligence Council report that's looking out at international relations and US foreign policy over the next 20 or so years. And it concluded that this pandemic has been the most significant singular global disruption since World War II. And that disruption has not just been a health disruption, it's disrupted economies, it's disrupted political systems, it's had all kinds of implications at the national and international security level. So when we think about this pandemic in those terms, we see how much of a crisis this has become for international relations and world affairs generally. I want to turn my attention just quickly to international law to sort of lay out why this too has been an enormous challenge for how we use international law across all of these various areas of international relations. So on this slide, this is not even an exhaustive list of some of the international legal issues or areas of international law that have arisen in this pandemic, but I just wanted to give you a sense of the scope of how international law has been affected by the COVID-19 pandemic. We could start with the international health regulations, which is the most specific treaty that we have, international agreement that we have that deals with serious infectious disease outbreaks. And the international health regulations, this pandemic has challenged it on a number of its key provisions, including surveillance, notification of diseases, WHO Director General's ability to declare a public health emergency of international concern, travel restrictions. I'll come back to the IHR because I'll do a little bit of a drill down on that. But it's not just the specific instruments for infectious disease outbreaks. We've had international legal questions come up about the WHO Constitution, especially in connection with the US attempt to withdraw from the WHO that was started under President Trump. This was one of those instances where people like myself who had been working on international law and global health for many, many years, when the US decided that it wanted to withdraw from the WHO, we were all scrambling around to figure out whether or not that you could do that. It was a question we had never explored before because we had never anticipated that any country, let alone one of the major powers, a reputed leader in global health, would attempt to withdraw from the WHO Constitution. We've had lots of issues arise in international human rights law, whether that involves non-pharmaceutical interventions, isolation, quarantine practices, the development of digital surveillance tools. Human rights issues have also come up in connection with access to vaccines. International environmental law has also been relevant to this context, especially with regards to the relationship between environmental degradation and zoonotic pathogens that spill over from nature into animals, into humans. We've also had the Biodiversity Convention and the Nagoya Protocol come into play, particularly in relationship to the sharing of virus samples and genetic sequence data on the SARS-CoV-2 virus. The UN Charter has come in for some critical analysis, especially with regards to the Security Council's failure to take any real meaningful action to help the international response on COVID. International trade law has come up, whether that's trade restrictions that were put in place to sort of keep different types of essential medical supplies and equipment at home as opposed to being exported, whether that's masks, PPE, ventilators. We've also had the patents issue come up again in the WTO with regards to access to vaccines. The controversy over the origins of the virus and whether or not it leaked from the Wuhan Institute of Virology brought the international law on biological weapons and biosecurity into play. Sovereignty and non-intervention have also made an appearance, especially in connection with demands for independent investigations on the origins of the pandemic. Claims that China violated the international health regulations and bears responsibility and an obligation for compensation under international and state responsibility was something that again had to be addressed. And finally, international law in cyberspace has also come into the picture. We've had ransomware attacks on health facilities during the pandemic. We've also had disinformation campaigns about the virus, the pandemic, and vaccines. So again, not even an exhaustive list of the international law here, but from an international lawyer's point of view, this was also a very big event. However, this did not go according to plan. And for those of us that worked on global health for much of the post-Cold War period, and for me, that's about 25 years, this was one of the most shocking and depressing aspects of watching the responses to this pandemic unfold. It's all, I mean, we've seen every type of adjective used to describe this pandemic. I mean, it's been a health, economic, political, governance, and legal failure, disaster, catastrophe, calamity, tragedy, nightmare. I mean, I think in my writings, I've run out of adjectives to describe how bad the handling of this pandemic has been, despite the fact that we knew something like this would happen, despite the fact that we spent many, many years trying to put in place policies, systems, instruments for that moment when the big one would hit. And what we unfortunately discovered was that countries were simply unprepared. And that's true even of high-income countries like the United States. I mean, even if we discount some of the problems associated with the policies of the Trump administration, we simply weren't prepared at the time Trump took office. So it doesn't really matter who was president when COVID-19 emerged. The United States was going to be in trouble. Also, in terms of other high capability countries like China, they too, their responses and reactions showed how unprepared they were for something that we had been working for decades on, trying to prepare countries to respond. As Rizwan pointed out, international cooperation on this particular disease outbreak completely broke down. And in many contexts, states didn't even try to pursue international cooperation in their responses on this. International institutions and governance regimes that were set up either specifically to deal with this type or had in the last 25 years had been given a role or had some involvement in global health context, these didn't work or didn't take any action. And that includes the United Nations, WHO, encountered lots of problems and criticisms, the G20, the G7, you could go on and on with regards to the problems at the institutional level. Governments weaponized the pandemic for political purposes, and that happened both domestically as well as internationally, and I'll come back to that problem in a bit. And finally, again, we have to sort of acknowledge that during this pandemic, international law was ignored, it was violated, it was abused, it was shown to be biased in terms of the interests of certain countries, inadequate, impotent. Again, we sort of run out of adjectives on this, including for some really critical issues that this pandemic helped highlight. International law was simply non-existent. And so I want to talk a little bit about, let me drill down a little bit on this awful response to the pandemic with regards to the international health regulations. So I want to come back to this. We could do this on a number of different international legal regimes, but given my time constraints, I just want to focus on this. All kinds of problems were identified in the bad responses of countries to the pandemic, focused on the international health regulations adopted by the World Health Organization in 2005. So we had problems with notification about serious disease events or their surveillance system, or problems with sharing really critical information about this disease event, especially human-to-human transition. And we also had global health governance problems associated with that particular problem in the IHR, particularly how WHO dealt with China during the very early weeks and months of the pandemic. Criticism, came about the power in the IHR on the Director General's ability to declare a public health emergency of international concern. Part of that criticism was that WHO delayed that declaration because it prioritized sovereignty and politics over global health. We've had huge issues with trade and travel measures, countries restricting travel in order to try to protect their populations from COVID. Here we had an interesting global health governance problem in that the WHO's initial recommendations against travel restrictions created lots of controversy, which just continued, particularly when such restrictions, if they were combined with other non-pharmaceutical interventions for this pathogen, actually seemed to help public health. So that controversy continues. We've had complaints that there's no ability to enforce the obligations in the IHR, or there's no provisions in the IHR that allow independent investigations of disease outbreaks, and there's no provisions in the IHR on equitable access to essential medical supplies or vaccines. And from the global health governance point of view, WHO does lack the authority to enforce the IHR. It doesn't have any powers to engage in independent investigations over the objections of a country involved. WHO did try to help create with other entities some non-binding mechanisms such as the COVAX facility, but that's really struggled to increase equitable access. So this is just a snapshot of some of the problems created for one part of international law that's relevant for global health purposes. I want to spend a little bit of time just talking about why did things go so bad? Why was this so so terribly wrong in terms of how the response at the national and the international levels unfolded. We could focus on some of the issues more specific to international law, whether that's how treaties work or what types of provisions the IHR had. And we could look at it at sort of that legal technical level. But for me, I think there were some transformations in international and domestic politics that converged when this pandemic arose to create the problems that we've seen with the responses. I think the first, for me, during most of the 25 years prior to this pandemic that I had been and others were working on the international politics, international law of infectious diseases, we really didn't have to deal with geopolitical competition, ideological competition, or technological competition. That was just not something that ever really came into the picture as we were trying to figure out how to prepare for the next one, the big one. And I think we've seen international politics transformed. And I think that transformation plays into the what went so terribly wrong in this case. The balance of power has returned to the international system. So now we have a new distribution of material power in the international system, which affects every issue area. And this is, again, something that the global health community had no experience with. This is not something in the post-Cold War period that we had to factor into how does international cooperation or international law function in this. And we know from previous historical periods that when the balance of power returns, it warps how countries, especially the great powers, the major players, look at all issues. And I think that's what we saw in this context. We've also seen the return of ideological competition. And again, something that really wasn't a factor, in most of the post-Cold War period. But now we've got a real competition between authoritarian approaches to international relations and the approaches taken by democracies. Also very interesting is that we now have technological competition in the global health area that we did not see before. So we've got American, Chinese, and Russian vaccines, all that have been competing for attention as this pandemic has, unfolded. And that, again, is something new. We just didn't see that in the post-Cold War period. And so that transformation in international politics, the return of these types of competition, I think is really has factored into why international cooperation hasn't functioned the way that it did before during most of the post-Cold War period. And I think it also colors what we might be seeing going forward. But that's not the only political transformation we've seen. I think we've seen some serious transformative developments in domestic politics around the world. Before the pandemic, we certainly began to see nationalism and populism becoming stronger forces within many countries around the world. And so that type of attitude towards domestic politics and its relationship with foreign affairs is not something that is going to be good when you're trying to deal with a pandemic where all countries are interdependent and need to cooperate. We also have this, when we've had this pandemic arise, this concept of health security that we've used for many, many years, this really narrowed down and was interpreted as that's national security, not some broader concept of global security or collective security, where we have to think about security and health in a broader context. It really narrowed down to a national security focus. Again, that's something that was different from what we saw in the pre-pandemic period or the post-Cold War period. Finally, I think one of the most shocking, astonishing things, especially for people in the United States, the democracies here have been dismal in their performance in this pandemic. And that includes the democracies that before the pandemic were long recognized as leaders in global health. And that includes the United States, but it goes well beyond that. So this was really a failure of the democratic community in the response to this particular pandemic. Brazil has had great difficulties. Canada, India, the European Union has struggled, the UK as well. And again, this was not something that we saw before. This was not really something that was anticipated with regards to the emergence of the type of serious disease threat that we've seen with this pandemic. And for me, I've been focused a lot on the return of the balance of power and geopolitics in not only what happened in this pandemic, but also as we look forward in this context. And I've done that because, as I've already indicated, we just didn't think about geopolitics and the balance of power in global health throughout that post-Cold War period. The United States had hegemonic or quasi-hegemonic power. China and Russia were not considered geopolitical threats. They weren't considered for most of this time peer competitors. We had democracies in that context in the ascendancy. Authoritarian governments seemed to be, in disarray and in retreat. And in that context, as we've tried to formulate ways of approaching pandemics and epidemics and other serious disease events, we just didn't have to think about the balance of power. Now we have to think about it. The problem is we don't really have any historical precedents for figuring out how do we think our way through geopolitics, the return of the balance of power, and trying to make progress so that we perform better when the next serious epidemic or pandemic emerges. And so some of the writing that I've been doing, these are just screenshots of titles of some things that I wrote last year and this year, where I'm starting to think through what this means for international law, international relations on global health. And at least so far, my analysis, superficial as it is up to this point in time, suggests that this is not good. This really, as we've seen in the pandemic, has changed the way the United States and China behaved. I think we also see that in connection with Russia. The piece I wrote about what are the implications of this change for Africa's place in global health suggests to me that, in an interesting way, during that post-Cold War period where we had more of a hegemonic system, Africa was actually really central. It was a priority. It was really at the heart of a lot of what was happening in global health. And I'm afraid that when we have the return of the balance of power politics, Africa might get moved to the periphery of global health as those geopolitical factors come into place. And I don't think global health is really, it's only at the beginning stages of trying to figure out what realpolitik means for the future of this particular area of international relations and international law. Let me just talk a little bit about the next one. And first, let me preface this focus on specific international and global health governance with just a little historical material. Past disruptions, these serious big disruptions in world affairs, have produced major governance and legal changes for international and/or global health. We used to call it international health, we call it global health today. World War I, we had the Health Organization of the League of Nations created, the Geneva Protocol, 1925, banning biological and chemical weapons in armed conflict. We had lots of treaties adopted after the First World War that were relevant to international health. The Second World War produced the World Health Organization. The WHO then adopted the International Sanitary Regulations. These later became the International Health Regulations. The General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade, that had provisions in it that were relevant to protecting public health. The end of the Cold War, also another big disruption, a transformation in international politics. This produced what I've been calling the golden age of global health governance. We had all kinds of things take place in this. We had WHO reform and rejuvenation. The human rights movement really, addressed the HIV/AIDS pandemic, WHO and WTO worked together on trying to align trade and health interests. That was unprecedented. We had the Millennium Development Goals, then leading to the Sustainable Development Goals that had health, integrated throughout that. We had multi-stakeholder entities created, like the Global Fund to Fight AIDS, Tuberculosis, and Malaria. International environmental law really developed in this post-Cold War period. Philanthropic foundations, especially the Gates Foundation, got involved in this. And then we had also the adoption of the international health regulations in 2005. And as a matter of historical, developments in this area, the IHR were at the time and continued to be the most radical instrument of international law ever adopted in the context of global health. The question then is, are we going to see in the disruptions, this transformations that we've seen, are we going to see similar types of major legal and governance reform in global health in the post-pandemic period? This slide just indicates that there are lots of proposals out on the table. I've just mentioned a few here with some specific examples. So, there are proposals to amend the IHR here, treaty amendment, or create new instruments, the pandemic treaty proposal. Lots of people that work in trade, environment, human rights, animal health want to go back, revisit the treaties that organize their activities and see what needs to be tweaked, revised, reformed for these purposes. At the level of global health governance, WHO reform, lots of people argue it needs more authority, more resources. Some people say we need high-level political leadership here. There's the proposal to create through the United Nations a Global Health Threats Council. Much more funding is needed for global health, especially for middle and low-income countries. We've got proposals on the table for facilities or funds that do that. We really need to address the governance gap that we have about equitable access to essential health goods during these types of health emergencies. So we've got proposals to make that COVAX, that ad hoc COVAX facility that was created during this pandemic, make that permanent so that we're ready the next time we have a serious outbreak, so that we have better access, more equitable access than we've seen in the context so far. So I'm happy to talk about any of these. There are other proposals out on the table. I just picked another one. So we've got a big reform agenda, here. The problem that I see here is about whether or not we're going to actually see any of these things the light of day. Let me just, before I talk about climate change, let me just say, first, part of the problem with this reform agenda is that the pandemic isn't over yet, and things don't look good for transformative international cooperation while this pandemic continues to rage. So from an epidemiological point of view, lots of people are not interested in talking about a treaty because the crisis is still going on, which we need to handle right now. So that's an urgent national focus that doesn't really flow well into some of these proposals. We also, I think, have a lot of discontent from the point of view of low-income countries about how responses to this pandemic have left them really high and dry, especially in connection with vaccine access. So I'm not sure that unhappiness, that anger, that frustration among many low-income countries it is going to facilitate transformative legal and governance change. And of course, we've got the geopolitical factor here, which has turned global health into a zero-sum game. And we see this, it's ongoing, it's not stopping, it's not getting any less of a problem, especially between the United States and China over the origins of the virus. The United States has serious problems with Russia and their disinformation campaigns about the pandemic as well as the vaccines. If we just think about the pandemic treaty proposal for a moment, this is sort of how these arguments play out. Look, we're thinking about the pandemic treaty is not going to help us flatten the curve on the Delta variant. It's not going to help us produce more vaccines. That's what we need to focus on now in terms of international security, or international health. Low-income countries, at least in the conversations I've been involved with, are very skeptical about this pandemic treaty proposal because they don't believe that it's going to come with more funding or it's going to have binding commitments about equitable access to vaccines in the future. At the moment, interestingly, China, Russia, and the United States don't support the pandemic treaty proposal. So it's hard for me to see how this goes forward when you have the three major powers opposed to this. If one of those countries changes its position and begins to support the pandemic treaty, then we're going to have the geopolitical problem come into play and create friction for moving forward in this context. So many of the factors specific to the pandemic, mitigate against getting too optimistic that this pandemic in this transformative context is going to produce these game-changing legal and governance reforms. But that's not the only problems that we face here. As you also know, now, if we didn't really understand it before, now we see that there's a problem that the global climate change, crisis has hit not only just at the international level, but at the national level. This may start distracting attention away from the post-pandemic legal and governance reforms to what we need to do to deal with climate change. So this is something also that is a potential distraction that takes political and economic capital away from reforming law and governance mechanisms in the context of the post-pandemic context. What's happened in Afghanistan in recent days, recent weeks is not about global health, but this is also this is a disaster that I think is going to have cross-cutting effects across many areas of international relations and certainly across the foreign policies of countries most directly affected, including the United States, European countries, countries in the region. We don't know how this is going to play out, but certainly the ramifications or implications of something on this magnitude, are going to potentially affect the willingness, the ability, or the context in which international cooperation needs to happen for changing the way that we use international law and global governance for pandemics. So I'll stop there and open it up, for questions so that we can have some back and forth on the pandemic, what's happened with international law and global health governance, and what we might be looking at moving forward in this context.
Thank you very much, Professor. We have many questions already. If you're ready, I would like to convey the questions to you.
Sure, certainly.
All right, Professor. The first question: what is your view on resorting to international or national legal cases regarding any liability for international health regulation violation during the COVID-19 pandemic?
Yes. So this was also something where those of us international lawyers have been working in global health. We sort of found ourselves scrambling to respond to the application of international on state responsibility. So as we know, if there's a violation of international law that creates damage, the country that's responsible for that violation has an obligation to, compensation in that context. That's an area of international law that across the history of international health cooperation and the history of the development of international law on transnational infectious disease threats, this is not an area of international law states ever used. It's just something that did not appear. And this is a history now that's, well over 150 years old. There have been occasionally claims made that certain countries are responsible for this, but no state seems to have taken it very seriously. In connection with the COVID outbreak, we've had this huge controversy and claims, particularly from not only the US government under the Trump administration, but also experts in the United States and elsewhere, that China violated the international health regulations. Those violations caused the harm that other countries are experiencing in the pandemic, and therefore China has an obligation, for compensation, reparations, what have you, under the international law of state responsibility. My perspective, on this is, I never believed that any country would actually follow through with using international law and state responsibility as a serious legal claim. And I think, and this is something I argued in March of 2020, and I think that's proved to be the case. Even the United States government, even under President Trump, never actually tried seriously to fit that into international legal mechanisms. This, for me, was another example of using international law as a geopolitical tool to bash China. Now, if we want to take seriously, so that to me, what we saw in this is an example of geopolitics warping how we use international law for geopolitical purposes. That's what I think happened. But if we want to take seriously, right, whether the international law and state responsibility has a role in future, thinking about future pandemics, we get into lots of difficult issues here. One of the first things, if we want to see, did China violate international health regulations? That's actually a more complicated and complex question than we might think. And so figuring out whether or not they did violate the international health regulations is our first hurdle. The second hurdle that we have here is that we know under international law of state responsibility, you can't blame another government for all the damage that might happen in connection with any given violation. And part of the problem that we have here is that national responses were so awful that it's very difficult to blame other countries for the failure of your government to respond. When you had ample notice to begin to take actions to deal with the problem. And I think here, that's one of the things that just destroyed any credibility of the US arguments in this context. We had noticed at the very beginning of January 2020 that something was happening in China. We had the opportunity to begin the wheels moving to get ready for something that was predicted, foreseeable, was potentially happening, and the US government failed to respond. So even in the context of using the pandemic as a sort of case study for should we go down this road in the future, creates a very complicated situation. My own personal view is we should not attempt to bring international law of state responsibility in as a key mechanism for dealing with the next one in this context. I don't think states are interested in it. It's too legally complicated. We've got better ways of potentially dealing with these threats.
Thank you very much, Professor. The next question comes from the chair of the Department of Law, Professor Rizwan. Could seeking an advisory opinion from the ICJ regarding the COVID-19 state responsibility be an option?
Well, I suppose it could be an option. The problem I think the ICJ is going to face is if we got down that path, the ICJ is going to face the same dilemma that we have at the moment, which is, if we're going to focus on China for the moment, did China violate the international health regulations? Let me just work through that little sort of some technical aspects. So we found out about the outbreak in Wuhan, didn't know what it was yet at the end of December, beginning of January, 2019, 2020. And the way that happened, actually, China followed the process that is in the IHR. So WHO got notification that something weird was going on in Wuhan from a non-governmental source. They asked the Chinese government for verification. The Chinese government verified that, yes, something was happening. And then China began to share information. So the surveillance system, the way the IHR set that up, it's hard to argue that China violated the IHR. Should China have identified this earlier and reported to WHO? That's an even harder question, because we know with novel emerging pathogens, even high income, high capability countries might not pick up all the signals as early as we might like. Second, did China violate the IHR in not sharing the information that it had on human-to-human transmission earlier than it did? There is an obligation in the IHR about that. There is potentially a stronger argument there that China did not share all the information that it had, that the SARS-CoV-2 virus did have human-to-human transmission characteristics. However, to sort of establish that, we need more information, which we can't get because we have this huge geopolitical fight over the origins of the virus and what China did in the early days. So it's hard for me to see that the ICJ is going to have any better access to the facts that we would need to establish whether there's a violation here. So in an advisory opinion, what does the ICJ do with that lack of information? We know that we could apply the international and state responsibility to this area of international relations as we can to anything. It certainly applies. It's just a question that an advisory opinion process, I think in this context, is simply going to inflame the geopolitics even more, which is going to make it even more difficult to do international cooperation on some things that we really desperately need to address.
Thank you very much, Professor. Here's the next question. As a matter of the US constitutional law, do you think that the US president could unilaterally withdraw from the WHO without any approval of the US Congress?
Well, the ratification under US constitutional law, the ratification of US participation in the WHO Constitution, which is a treaty, was conditioned on certain criteria being met. So under the US constitutional law, the president does have the authority to withdraw from treaties unilaterally. We know this from lots of different treaty contexts. However, if the Senate, in giving its advice and consent to the ratification of a treaty, puts conditions on that withdrawal, right? Under the constitutional system, the president has to follow those conditions. And we had those conditions in the legislation adopted, or the advice and consent given to the president when the United States accepted the WHO Constitution. So we say that we see the executive branch and the legislative branch both having roles in how the United States withdraws from a treaty. Absent those sorts of conditions, yes, the president does have the power to withdraw from treaties unilaterally. It may create political problems for the president with Congress, but that power exists. And that's why if the president, Donald Trump had won the election in 2020, and that process would have continued and those conditions were fulfilled from a US constitutional point of view, yeah, the United States can withdraw from treaties. And we know, just as a matter of international law, that treaties are based on consent, and most treaties have either specific withdrawal provisions, or we understand that the way that treaties work, you can withdraw your consent from that as long as the conditions for withdrawing the consent are met.
Thank you very much, Professor. Our next question. WHO has generally preferred to take non-regulatory approach to IHR or applying pressure on states. Do you think that it should continue to do so or take more legalistic approach?
Well, what's interesting about what the WHO can do under the IHR is that ability of WHO to do some interesting things and create incentives for countries to cooperate is actually hardwired directly into the IHR. So it's difficult to separate non-regulatory from legalistic when the treaty itself sets up this dynamic. And let me just give you a couple of examples about this. And here I want to connect, or I want to use these examples also to illustrate how radical the IHR is as a treaty, particularly as it relates to sovereignty. All right, so let me go back to the ability of WHO to use information about disease outbreaks that it receives from non-governmental actors. And it can use this information over the objections or the oppositions of the states in question. That means, as a government, that it's really hard to cover up a disease outbreak if NGOs are sending all this information to WHO. So WHO doesn't get any indication or alert from China on December 30th or 31st. It gets that from ProMed which is a non-governmental organization which scours the web for information. WHO then can go to China, ask for verification. China then is locked into the IHR context here. All right. Also, the WHO Director General has the power to declare a public health emergency of international concern, also over the objection of the government directly affected. That's a political power that IHR gives the WHO. And there are some other provisions in there that do the same sort of thing. The larger point here is the IHR created this sort of dynamic to get countries to realize they needed to cooperate early and often and transparently with the WHO, because it was almost impossible to cover up a disease outbreak. If you tried to do so, this was going to create real political and economic problems for you down the road. So some of those aspects of how WHO cooperates with countries and tries to get countries to cooperate and share information, right, it's not necessarily all wrapped up in international law, but its foundation is that authority that WHO is given under the IHR to do these things. The problem that we encountered here, I don't think, is with that vision, right, that design. The problem here is that you had one of the world's two great powers refusing to follow those incentives and not cooperating transparently and fully with WHO. I don't know how international or WHO deals with that problem. Then you had the other world's great power decide to weaponize this for its rivalry with China. Again, that's very difficult for the IHR, the WHO to deal with, whether it's non-regulatory or whether we're thinking about different types of international legal rules.
Thank you very much. Professor, our next question. Would you please share your views on the reduction in public funding and increasing private funding in WHO?
Yes, this is one of the aspects of that post-Cold War revolution, if you will, in global health governance, was the increased participation of non-governmental actors. And that includes philanthropic foundations like Gates, Rockefeller, and others, but also the participation in some of these global health governance contexts of the private sector. And so what we had in that post-Cold War period was this dynamic in which funding for global health, including funding for WHO, increased in ways that we had just never seen before. More money was devoted towards global health purposes than at any time we'd ever seen in this context. However, much of that funding was not through the assessed contributions that come out of the WHO constitution for member states. It was voluntary contributions to WHO that's controlled by the donors, whether that donor is a state or whether that donor is a philanthropic foundation. This, of course, means that WHO can't use that money for the broad blueprints that WHO establishes through as a member state organization to benefit all of the member states. These are these vertical programs which donors facilitate here. So on the one hand, there's more money coming in to global health than we've ever seen before. In many ways, that new money is making WHO more important than it had ever been, because WHO then gets involved in all of these new programs, this new funding. The flip side of that is that money and how that authority and where the money is spent and on what purposes isn't driven by the organization itself. And so that has led to questions about the legitimacy of those funding patterns. This goes to the proposal that we have seen in the wake of the pandemic that assessed contributions, mandatory contributions to the WHO should be increased so that WHO has a bigger bigger pot of money that it can then allocate based on the input of all member states in a more democratic way of allocating budgets. I have to say that proposal's been on the table for 25 years and it's never gone anywhere. And that's one of the proposals I think is already dead in the water. This was an issue that was supposed to be discussed at the last World Health Assembly meeting in May of this year, and it was the next thing what the World Health Assembly did was kick the can down the road. More voluntary contributions are still welcome. No increase in assessed contributions. That problem is why we also now have proposals about a global health threat fund or an international pandemic financing facility outside WHO. The problem with those proposals is they've also been around for about 25 or 30 years. Those usually end up being voluntary funds that countries can pay into, and they can then also control what happens with that money. So we've got real problems breaking out of that particular, dynamic. When I reflect on the post-Cold War period, and I saw how much more important WHO became because of those new funding streams, I hesitate to, maybe finish the logic of the illegitimacy of how that's determined just on pragmatic grounds. If we want global health to be more politically important and we want more money coming into global health, and that actually makes a member state organization like WHO more important than it would have otherwise been, perhaps we need to try to continue to work that model so that we can continue to make WHO more important, and address some of these needs that we've got. In the current context, particularly with regards to geopolitical competition, and secondly, at the domestic level in many states, probably aren't going to be willing to increase the funding. That one's going to be a hard challenge.
Thank you very much, Professor. Our next question. Notification of public health emergencies to WHO can have obvious adverse economic consequences for the notifying states. Is there any way to incentivize states to be more forthcoming in notifying deadly infectious diseases?
Yeah, that question puts its finger right on one of the biggest problems that has plagued the use of international law in international health and global health since the first International Sanitary Conference in 1851. If you report that your country is having a serious disease outbreak, your fear is that other countries then are going to hit you with economic, measures that cause damage to your economy. And then that economic damage could cause political problems for the government. So the incentive there then is not to report. And try to deal with it yourself so that you don't get hammered on the economic and the political side. During most of the period of time where we had treaties in place from 1851 all the way up to the new international health regulations adopted in 2005, that problem constantly, plagued those treaties, and the treaties just wouldn't work. And so countries wouldn't report the outbreaks to try to cover it up. They eventually, the information got out. They still got hit with trade and travel measures. And the old international health regulations, the international sanitary regulations, and their precursors just sort of fell apart from both ends partly because of, and often mainly because of that problem. This is why the IHR adopted in 2005 are so radical. Because the earlier system was WHO could only act on information it got from governments. It couldn't do anything with information that it had from non-governmental sources. When you change that dynamic, now a country knows that if it doesn't cooperate early and often with WHO, it's going to get hammered anyway. But if it looks like it's complying with the IHR, it's trying to share information, that creates a better environment for other countries not to panic and to begin to hammer that country with trade and travel restrictions because there's a serious disease outbreak. So the IHR attempt to give WHO authority it did not have before, that changes incentives about how you respond to this context. Now, in some of the outbreaks we've seen since the IHR was adopted in 2005, that dynamic has worked. I think it worked in the H1N1 pandemic in 2009, 2010. In other outbreaks, Ebola in 2014 in West Africa, we had some real problems with that. That's produced we need other types of incentives, whether that's funding for countries that, report diseases according to the IHR, or some type of insurance mechanisms that provides those countries that do perform as responsible global, citizens for these, purposes. So we've had other proposals to try to get around it. The biggest problem that I see in connection with this issue coming out of the COVID-19 pandemic is that WHO got it wrong with its recommendations on travel restrictions. Actually, it turned out that countries that applied travel restrictions in connection with other public health, non-pharmaceutical interventions, those travel restrictions had public health benefit. And so I'm afraid that we're not coming out of the COVID pandemic going to have serious discussions on further fixes to that problem, that problem between economic, damage and reporting disease outbreaks. Partly because, we have to admit, that was wrong advice for this pathogen. It might have been right for Ebola, but it wasn't the correct information at the critical time from WHO about this pathogen. So that's going to make it far more difficult for countries to relinquish the ability to use trade and travel restrictions against future outbreaks.
Thank you very much, Professor. Professor, we've already taken a lot of your time. However, we do have 3 more questions. Would you be willing to entertain them? Thank you very much, Professor, for your time. The next question comes from the chair of the Department of Law again, Professor Rizwan. He says, Professor Gary J. Bass has implied that democracies have typically been less suited to deal with infectious diseases than authoritarian regimes. You seem to second that. So what to do about it?
Yeah, this is again part of this ideological component of what we have to think about in global health. That, again, I'm trying to be honest, we just didn't struggle with this during most of the post-Cold War period, and maybe we should have, focused more on that. But now we have comparisons between the way democracies respond to infectious disease outbreaks and authoritarian countries respond to this. And this conversation is going to, continue. And it's difficult to answer that question because partly we don't really have any good evidence that authoritarian governments responded, fantastically to the COVID-19 outbreak either. So in some ways we have an ideological problem going every which way. In addition, we are concerned about the way in which some authoritarian governments applied non-pharmaceutical measures that may have had public health benefits, but many people believe violate human rights, or the weaponization of the pandemic to increase national security or police powers in terms of surveilling the population, when the real motive there wasn't about protecting, their population from the next pandemic. So how we evaluate what was a good and a bad response to an infectious disease outbreak as between democracies and authoritarian governments actually is really complicated. And I'm afraid that it often gets simplified or the analysis is made simplistic. The problem from the point of view of the community of democratic countries is that the response from it's comprehensive failure, awful responses. And these are the countries that were long recognized as leaders in global health. And part of that problem, I think from the US point of view, is that the domestic political confidence or the domestic political stability that we had throughout most of the post-Cold War period is gone. And so the capability to act boldly, to act in cooperative ways, to think about pandemics as a collective security threat as opposed to a national security threat, that's gone. That's one of these major transformations that we're just now trying to figure out how this is going to affect the way that countries perform. But I think this is going to be one question or comparison that's going to linger, not only from an epidemiological point of view, but because I think because of the geopolitical and ideological competition that is going to continue.
Thank you very much, Professor. Our second last question With less involvement of the US and some other Western democracies, do you envision China and other emerging powers having a more significant role in the WHO and any similar global regime or incentives?
It's certainly possible, and this is what drives global health people crazy, right? So now we're thinking about China becoming playing a bigger role in global health because they want more geopolitical influence and leverage because the United States. This, from a global health point of view, it's warping how we look at the problem. My sense of this is now part of our reality. And what I've sensed in talking to, or in the many conversations that I've had about, how do we do this better going forward? At the geopolitical level, particularly from people that have been on these conference calls or Zoom calls that I participated in that are from middle and low income countries, they're very angry, not only at the United States and Europe. They're disappointed not only in the community of democracies, but they're not thrilled that China might be filling that vacuum. They don't want to be caught between the rivalry between the democratic West, China, Russia, and authoritarian states, because we know from the Cold War that when that happens, countries have to then figure out how to play that game, which may mean that their interests, their values, their problems have to be filtered through geopolitics before anybody pays attention. And so one of the things that I've sort of floated as what is necessary in this context is, in the same way that we had during the Cold War, where countries that didn't want to be trapped by that bipolar superpower, realpolitik, non-aligned movement, different ways of having alliances and coalitions that tried to put their interests, their values, their problems higher on the political agenda to play the superpowers off against each other so that their voices in international relations would have greater sway. I think that's something that's needed now in global health. We had some of that in the post-Cold War period, but it again wasn't in a balance of power context. It was more dealing with the larger, more hegemonic power of the Western countries. I think now that we have geopolitics back in place, it's incumbent, if low-income countries want their voices heard more loudly, that sort of coalition formation, begin and be part of this discussion about what are we going to do to make sure that the next one isn't as big a disaster this time. This will have short-term adverse consequences for the potential for international cooperation, because those coalitions might have to say, no, I'm not going to sign up to a pandemic treaty unless you meet these demands. I think in the longer run, if you have that more of that balancing from the perspective of low-income countries, that might be able to produce some progress with regards to global health, especially as the great powers become more consumed by other problems. At some point, this pandemic and global health is going to begin to fall down the agendas of foreign policy priority for these countries. And if they then want to look as if they're competing effectively with China in low-income countries on global health, they might then be more willing to listen to what low-income countries are having to say. But it's going to be a rough road between the point where we are now, the formation of those types of coalitions, and results that may come out of international cooperation, global health governance, or international law.
Thank you very much, Professor. Here's your last question. Do you think using Chapter 7 of the UN Charter to deal with public health emergencies is a good idea?
Well, let's plug that into what happened in this pandemic. You would have had vetoes right away. The process is over. I mean, I don't, in a context where you have geopolitical rivalry as intense and fierce as it is right now, and it's going to be over the course of the next decade, I don't see the Security Council having a role in this context. And this is something where we've noticed that the United States, well, both the United States and China had choices here that they made, and they both decided to treat this pandemic as part of geopolitical competition. The way the United States chose to do that was not inevitable. We had other choices that we could have made. For example, I believe that even under President Trump, but certainly I was hoping under President Biden, the United States would reach out bilaterally to China and create some global health détente between the two countries. Both countries, now they're the two big powers. They have responsibilities here. They need to sit down and begin to talk to each other about how do we avoid these problems going forward, right? The Biden administration has not chosen that path. They've chosen to turn up the geopolitical heat on China on the origins of the virus. That's made things worse. That idea, I think, is dead in the water. But it's that kind of taking responsibility, acting bilaterally at the great power level is going to have more possibilities than using Chapter 7. I mean, many people say like the Security Council failed in, and maybe even I said it earlier today, the Security Council failed to do anything on the pandemic. Well, no, the charter is set up so that great powers have, veto. If you don't get those 5 veto holding powers to agree. So many of these provisions are process provisions. The process worked. We just didn't like the outcome. It wasn't that the Chapter 7 failed there. It was just that the process did not produce the outcome that many wanted to have. And you don't see many proposals going to, should we use Chapter 7 more or change Chapter 7, in that long list of proposals, because I think people don't believe that Chapter 7 is going to be an effective mechanism for dealing with the next one.
Professor David Fidler, thank you very, very much for your patience. We've gone way out of your time, and thank you to all of the audience present here. For those of you who might have missed Professor Fidler's parts of this lecture, we will be uploading it in our YouTube channel. Professor, thank you very much, and we do look forward to have you once again, with some other topic maybe.
All right.
Thank you very, very much.
Thank you
very much. Thank you all.